Case 623 by Danny Yu. Chapter 39. Much earlier. We made a mistake, says Pierce. What makes you think that? Zola asks. Tony wasn't sure how long he stayed like that, lying flat on the ground with his daughter. His daughter! What the actual heck? Curled up on top of him, the both of them clutching one another so tightly he was surprised he was still managing to breathe. He couldn't even describe how it felt, the warmth and relief and deep-seated love of it. The closest he got was how he still remembered feeling when he first told Jamie after returning from Afghanistan. Part of him was screaming that he was being an idiot, was being taken advantage of, that he couldn't trust this without a DNA test on the table. But the feeling was there, so deep it hurt and more real than anything else around him, so tangible he felt he could almost reach out and touch the connection. Something had been missing ever since the beginning. He'd sensed it, and Jamie had lived with it every single day of his life, and here she was. In the end, it was as simple as that. And then suddenly, there was a blur of displaced air, and Maria was gone. Red sparks overtook Tony's vision, and he was thrown back several feet, feeling as though he'd been punched by the Hulk, even though he was certain no one had touched him. Fighting back a groan, he pulled himself up to his elbows. He was met with the sight of Bruce on the right-hand side, threatening to turn green, and the Maximoffs were on his left, glaring at him. The boy was holding Maria against his front, hands tight on her solid little shoulders. Tony did his very best to get to his feet, help his little girl, but he fell back with a groan, and near swimming to the point where his legs felt like rubber. "Pietro!" Maria screamed. "Pietro, let me go! Stop hurting him, Wanda!" And then she threw back her elbow, slammed it into Pietro's midsection, and for all that he was about twice her size, he flew back, curled around his own stomach. Maria rushed to Tony's side, placing herself solidly in front of him. Judging by the set of her shoulders alone, she was glaring defiantly at everyone and everything. As if in sync, the two Maximoffs looked from Maria to Tony and back to Maria again. Both sets of eyes widened incredulously, and Tony kind of understood their bafflement. Jamie and Tony had always been visibly, recognizably related, but their physical similarities seemed to lessen the older Jamie got. He had the same build Tony had at that age, but as for the rest of it, most of their similarities these days were more of the internal sort. Jamie's hair was several shades lighter than his, and for all that it became messy at the slightest hint of winter moisture, it had grown almost pin straight, and with every single day that passed, more of the baby softness abandoned his face, leaving behind an ever-certain promise of a truly impressive angular square face. Maria, on the other hand, her hair was the exact same shade as Tony's. It had the exact same, just barely fulfilled hint of a curl. Her eyes were the same color, the same shape. She was taller and stronger than Tony had been at her age, looking closer to him at 9 than at just barely 6. But overall, aside from the chin-length hair and cleft to chin, they could have been twins. Frankly, Tony was fairly certain pretty much anyone who saw them side by side would say the DNA test was unnecessary. There was a strange sense of warmth at that thought, despite all the ways this situation was so serious. He couldn't stop staring at her. Couldn't believe she was real. Maria was real. That was really going to take some getting used to. "Johanny," the girl Maximoff said anyway, voice taking on that annoying, condescending tone some people like to use on kids. Tony had spent his whole childhood frustrated by that tone. "We have to go. The transport is not going to wait." If possible, Maria's shoulders straightened further. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I told you," she added. "I told you my daddy was going to come for me. I'm not leaving him now." Tony's chest clenched. God, where had he got these brave, loyal children of his? How the hell did that ever happen? He was grateful, obviously, but he honestly didn't think anything had ever overwhelmed him more. He was also more ashamed than he could ever have said, because he hadn't come for her. He hadn't planned to, never would have, if not for Ultron. If he'd known she was real, if he'd taken the time to truly listen to Jamie all these years, he'd have come for her long ago. But he hadn't, and God, that was something he was going to have to live with. Somehow, despite the nauseating pain still pulsing through his head, he got to his feet and managed a staggering step, reaching out warily, uncertain of his welcome. He let his hand hover for a moment until he was certain Maria knew he was there, When she didn't move away, he closed his hand around her shoulder, bit back something close to a sob at the feel of it, and God, all he wanted was to draw her close and hug her and never let her go. For right now, in a situation as charged as this, he had to leave her some space. "These are the Avengers," Boy Maximoff said, as though that was self-explanatory. Perhaps it was. They were straight out of Hydra, after all, and there was a thought that was going to keep him awake at night for the rest of his life. His little girl growing up in the hands of Hydra. All those frightening questions Jamie had asked on her behalf over the years. He couldn't even stand to think of it. "I don't care," Maria spat. "That's Tony Stark," the girl Maximoff said, sounding a bit like a Greenpeacer on board an oil tanker. "That's my daddy," Maria said again. She was damn near screaming now. "That's my daddy, and I love him, and I didn't do anything wrong. I just want to go home with him and see my room and play with Jamie and do loud stuff with Uncle Bruce." Her shoulders were shaking now, Tony realized. He squeezed her shoulder carefully, rustled down, and your physical need to hold her close. Keep her safe. Later, and then all the time in the world. "I want you to come too," Maria added, and her voice was cracking now. "You're my friends. I don't want to lose you." "I don't care what those two do, as so long as they don't turn around and kill us all," Clint said, and Tony jumped, turning his head to look at where the others were walking towards them. Steve and Thor both looked vacant, wounded. Natasha was leaning onto Clint's shoulder as though she'd keel over and die without the support. Worry flooded through Tony, along with the question of how long they'd been listening and how much they even understand. "But whoever we're bringing has to get on the jet. We're leaving now." Tony completely bypassed the pilot's seat as he entered the quinjet. He was in no condition to attempt to fly anyway, would probably manage to accidentally find the nearest mountain and crash. He was peripherally aware of Clint guiding Natasha to a seat before heading for the controls. Bruce moved the armor inside before wrangling Thor and Steve into seats as well. Tony, for his part, sank down onto the nearest padded bench. Maria scrambled in next to him before climbing into his lap, curling up against his chest with her legs hanging awkwardly to one side. Tony wrapped his arms around her, the motion completely instinctive. He buried his face in her stunningly thick hair and breathed in the unfamiliar scent of her, cradling her like a toddler, for all that she was big enough that his thighs would probably start aching in just a few moments. Tony let his eyes slide shut, focusing on the warm weight of his daughter, the relief from some kind of looping dread he'd never even fully been able to name, but had felt for years. There were so many things he wanted to tell her, so many apologies he wanted to give, so many questions he wanted to ask. Yet somehow in that moment, all his words seemed to fail him. He couldn't figure out how to speak a single one, could only hold her and silently swear to never let her go. Thankfully, Maria didn't seem to mind, just squirmed closer, clutching at his undersuit as if she were just as scared to let go of him as he was to lose her. He wasn't sure how long they'd been flying when he became aware of the Maximoffs whispering to one another a few feet away. He couldn't immediately place the language, but he knew enough related ones, Russian and assorted Romance languages mainly, that he was pretty sure he understood at least 80% of what they said and could figure out the rest pretty easily from context. He might still not have tuned into their conversation, except he'd heard his name in there, which made them suddenly impossible to ignore. "Stuck, and he's just sitting there, and we're going to do nothing," Girl Maximoff said, sounding more than a bit upset, and a sense of dread came rolling in to sit alongside all the rest of the emotions currently weighing Tony down. "We're not," Boy Maximoff said. "Johanna's been with us for a year, and we've taken care of her, and we're not going to... You remember how much it hurt? And we know how much she's wanted to be with her father. We can't do that to her, or her brother, not until she's learnt what kind of man he is, and realized she'll be much better off without him." "But he..." "I know," Boy Maximoff said, "but whenever we do, it will come back to hurt Johanna, and that's not what we want. That's not... I would never want anything like that for her." Girl Maximoff slumped, but nodded, and Tony squeezed his eyes shut again, careful not to let on that he'd been listening, let alone that he'd understood. He was going to have to look into whatever perceived wrong he'd done the Maximoffs, figure out some way to deal with this. Until he did, the dread wouldn't go away, and more importantly, the Maximoffs were clearly important to Maria, and vice versa. There had to be some solution that could be found, just as soon as Tony figured out what the problem actually was in the first place. Maybe 10 minutes later, Bruce cleared his throat, and Tony opened his eyes, trying to catch up with what was going on around him. Maria had slid off his lap, but was still plastered to his side, head resting against his bicep. Natasha, Steve, and Thor seemed slightly more aware, and Natasha was glaring holes through Girl Maximoff. "We took a hit," Bruce said, pausing a moment to turn sharp green eyes on Girl Maximoff. "And we're going to need to regroup and recover, at least until we figure out what Ultron's next move will be." "You want to go off the grid," Tony concluded. "Listen, I have plenty of places we can go, but none of them are exactly secret. But hey, if anyone has a request, we can head to any Stark property in the world." Clint didn't reply, seemed more than a little indecisive. He glanced over his shoulder, definitely focusing on the Maximoffs before looking back at the controls, still silent. Girl Maximoff let out an exaggerated sigh. "I already know where you wish to go," she told Clint. "You are very afraid of us finding it, but you need not worry. We do not have children." The look Clint shot over his shoulder at her was more than a bit frightened, actually, and shocked, and so full of a strange protective rage, Tony thought for a moment he'd leap out of his seat and try to strangle her or something. Natasha reached up and raked her fingers through her hair. "I don't think she's lying, Clint. Just take us there. If she tries anything, I'll kill her myself." The last was said with enough of a glare that Girl Maximoff that she actually shrank back in her seat. Tony shut his eyes again and pulled Maria closer against his side. He did not have the capacity to process any more emotions right now, so it was better to just ignore all the shit until he could deal with it.